Okay. Just sit forward on your chair a little bit for a few moments. Try and have some of your weight, about a third of your weight, in your legs, just to remind you that this is really what we're kind of aspiring to. As always, you're not stuck in this position, and as always, when you start to find it maybe having an effect on your back that you're uncomfortable with or something like that, then sit back. It's not worth the strain. And really, all of these things that we say about posture in Tai Chi should be seen as aspirations. We have, on the one hand, we have the diagrams in books and the theory and so on and so forth. But then, on the other hand, we have where we actually are, and we have to make that transition very slowly, very gently, really. Try and get a sense of just settling into your chair. Feel that weight in your feet and your legs. Feel that your upper body is supported, and that the front of your upper body is supported by your back. So there's a kind of hierarchy, if you like, of support. The floor supports everything, and the connection with the floor through your feet and your legs will support your upper body, and your back will support the front of your upper body. And just rubbing your hands together, tapping over your face. Over your head and neck. Down to one shoulder and your arm. On the other side. Half your chest. Belly. And finally, your legs. Now, feet out, sit back in your chair. So one of the main reasons for using this posture at this point is because, when, particularly in the standing exercise, but also in the seated, one of the phrases used for the way that we settle in is that we sit in to the hips, we sit into the legs. And so there's this sense in which we're trying to settle in much the same way as we might in a comfortable chair. And this is quite unusual, of course, when we're thinking about upright postures. We normally don't think in terms of that sort of quality of relaxation, of releasing, and so on. So reminding ourselves at this stage of what that can feel like is important, because we can then take that awareness back into the upright postures. So, as always, one of the key things is just allowing your weight to drop and being aware of the point of contact, wherever you feel the chair touching your back, and then sort of like lower back, hips, buttocks, depending on just how you're fitting in to the chair. Those are the parts that will initially want to release, to allow that sinking down. And then we notice various effects. I mean, one effect that I've talked about before is on breathing. That's a very obvious thing to focus on if you're comfortable focusing on your breathing, because breathing is a form of movement. The ribs expand and contract, and so on and so forth. And one of the things that we're looking for in general in the postures is to enhance the movement within the body. Breathing, circulation, digestion, all the major kind of metabolic functions seem to involve some kind of movement. But on a more subtle level, this sense of the connecting principle is partly the connection of the breathing. It's like if you have a balloon full of water, say, and you press in on one side, then the water will increase in pressure, and you could probably pick that slight increase up on the other side of the balloon. And in the same way, you know, what happens in our feet will have an influence on what happens in, say, our shoulders or something. So the connecting principle is obviously through bones, muscles, so on and so forth, but also through something a little less definable in some ways. And this leads us into this awareness of a kind of group energy, if like collective energy that exists within the body. So you come back to the upright position with that very much in mind. It's not something that we can deliberately create. You can't just say, "Oh, right, so now I've got this." But it's a kind of feeling, and we may use the imagery of, say, the balloon, the memory of what it felt like to sit back in the chair, and so on. But again, just remember, if you find that your lower back, for instance, is starting to ache, move back a little bit. Try not to sit right back, because that would take you away from the correct position. But again, you know, if you need to, sit back and rest. So just starting to turn your head, and almost straight away, you can begin to feel that, you know, we're turning our head. We're obviously using the muscles of the neck, but you may be able to detect movements change down through your back, either side of your spine, a little way, maybe in the pectoral muscles and tissues linked with the rib cage. Maybe up the side of your face. And then your shoulders. And then forwards. This too, I mean, obviously there's connections, if you like. When my elbows go up, I can do an extension in the sides, for instance. You may feel something different. Hands down to your sides, and then rotate. Although these small movements can form very definable patterns, there's also an element to them that is, I wouldn't say random, but your experience of an exercise may change from one day to the next, or even as you go through the exercise with some of the movements. And then winding around. And back the other way. And rest your hands. Easing forwards and pushing back. Turn a little bit. So now more of your weight going into this leg. Remember, we want a free passage of movement. So when you do a movement, and especially with these earlier movements where it may be easier to spot some kind of resistance, when you meet that barrier, whatever it is, then the principal thing that we're trying to do is to increase this ability to release this sort of opening up of the area. And sometimes we can do that just by bringing our attention to that area with the idea that that's what's going to happen. And then in the other direction. So we might think of the transition from the tightly clenched fist to the hollow fist. It's still a fist. We haven't just collapsed, but we're no longer gripping tightly. So if you're familiar with that feeling, going around. Another image that I've used quite often is water flowing over a rock in a river, gradually smoothing the rock off. And a different image related to the fist is an interesting one. If you imagine holding a stone in or rock in your hand, if you grip it tightly, it hurts. But if you can just open your fingers a little bit, you've still got the stone there, and it doesn't hurt as much. So this suggests a kind of releasing around the edges of the blockage. Change direction. Alongside that, we may want to think about how we're doing the movement. So if, for instance, you're getting with this exercise a bit of kind of like discomfort, maybe in the middle of your back, ask yourself what you're doing here. Are you moving the pelvis and drawing your shoulders around, or are you trying to move the shoulders, because that will impact the middle of your back. The whole of the upper body we want to use as one unit. And then stepping through. And if you practice these ideas with very simple movements like this one, and some of the earlier exercises that we do, like bird folds its wings, fisherman casts its net, then these things will start to become habitual to you, and you won't need to give them quite so much attention for them to work for you. And then on the other side, stepping out. None of what I've just said is intended to be complete. You know, if you do have that stiffness in your neck, or feeling the blockage somewhere, or discomfort or pain, these things might help to release that. Sometimes the pain is just there. Maybe we stepped on one side, or we pulled a muscle, or something like that. But as always, anything that persists and doesn't seem to be responding, or you're not comfortable with the response, you might need to seek further advice on the GP or something like that. So we can, the exercises can help us a great deal, but I suppose it's common sense really. But I always try and make this point that they're not miracle cures. I wish that they were, but they're not. So hands down to your sides, turn your hand palm forwards, and once again, weight flowing forwards, pelvis tilting, and the arms rotating. So a good starting point is just to observe when you do this exercise, or any of the exercises, in particular the ones that you're familiar with, well, what is happening, and my foot's a bit out of line and it feels a bit odd, or so that we learn to create so it's almost like there's a kind of place in our brain that is able to observe and monitor what's going on inside of ourselves almost constantly. And I think this is something that becomes a kind of benefit outside of the actual formal practices. And then fisherman cast a net. So that term releasing that I used, remember the clenched fist to the open fist, letting go is another one, softening, are all aspects of the Chinese term sung. Sung is the term that is often simply translated as relaxed. But as you will see, if you work with these ideas, relax is certainly part of it, but it's by no means the whole story. If I have the tightly clenched fist here and I think, oh, I'm just going to relax it, that's going to happen. I will no longer have the fist. So it's quite a tricky balance to work with. Between having a shape and a pattern, but not letting that shape or pattern harden up. And then rolling the ball. Another thing you may find is that a particular exercise will help with that, with stiffness in your back or the chest, feeling a bit clogged up or something like that. And then the pigeon spreads its wings. One more time. Drawing back. Elbows still going out, but your hands staying more in front of your hips. Push and wave. Four. Now, hands loosely fisted, going back. Keep your elbows in front of your hips a little bit. Just let your arms extend out. Don't lock your elbows. More. Bring your hands out. Winding around and back into your hips again. Notice that the pattern of the movement, the rhythm of the movement, always draws you back to this central position. And one thing I find useful is to really focus on that. Just here, I talk about these punctuation points. And it's not that it's in sort of like subjectively, if you like, any more important than the outward movement, because we're really looking to cultivate both, because they're interdependent. And that, really and truly, even that is not a good way of thinking of it, because it still implies that they're separate. But in practice, objectively, I think most of us are likely to overlook the withdrawing movement far more than the extending stage of the movement. It's almost like we panic about it. So, we might get to here, go out and say, oh, I've got to push forwards again. We undervalue the yin aspect of the movements quite often. So try to keep a nice steady pace. Turn your hands palm down. And again, observing where you might speed up. Polishing the table. And here, coming around. Into here. I pointed out somebody once that a particular move in a Tai Chi form, they kept getting wrong. And that what they did was they were speeding up at that particular point. They're going a little bit faster. And they said, so the reason I speed up is that I really like that bit and it feels nice going fast. And I was like, yep, but it was incorrect. And it's going to stay incorrect until you sort of slow it down. So, for instance, here, all sorts of things could go wrong. You might get to here and then just go back. But in fact, I go this way a little bit and then this way. It's almost like I'm exaggerating a little bit here, but I get to here. Like if I was going to throw a ball, I would pull back and then release. Or maybe you're like this person and you get to here, it's like, oh, this is fun. And then the hands go all over the place. You might not have a good circle, for instance. And it's less about the speed of the body than it is about the speed of the intent behind the movement. Here, changing, sinking down, taking your time to sink in and to feel the push up. And then sinking. If you were bouncing up and down on a trampoline, you would wait until you felt a push before you tried anything fancy in terms of going up. Otherwise, what point is there in having the trampoline? And so one of the ways in which the root, the dropping of our center of gravity, functions is that it leads us into this quality of springiness in feet, legs, buttocks, hips and lower back. And we let the weight of the upper body flow down into that to create the pressure. And then it's almost like we get bounced out of it. So here, there's a great deal going on in terms of releasing around hips and that kind of area. But also a quality of just observing the movement, waiting for that slight sense of a push upwards that we can blend with. and then the wild goose. It's a bit more difficult, but just as important in the long run is that same sense of a comma in a sentence, that same sense of a punctuation point at the end of the expanding movement. So we don't want this to happen. You get to here, I feel my body beginning to contract into the root, my elbows get drawn down, my fingers follow. Not necessarily that slowly, but that would be the sort of stages of the movement. Again, I'm exaggerating. It's the opposite in the lower part of the movement, in the sense that I start to feel the expansion. That pushes the elbows out, and in their turn, the elbows pull the fingers up. We begin to notice these patterns of movement much more in our body. It's one of the advantages that comes out of a more focused attention. Changing this time to Heart in the Clouds. It's also something that helps us to notice more about the movement. So it's not sort of a one-way passage, and gradually our attention coming more and more deeply into our body. And it's quite likely that that process of our thoughts arriving, say, in our feet or in our center, is accompanied by some kind of response in our nervous system. And if we practice it enough, that response will become much more habitual too. I was going to say automatic, but perhaps the wrong way to describe it. Now, let your hands drop down, so the weight of your arms hanging from the shoulders. Dragon plucks the stars from the sky. This is one that is often indicative of that speeding up. We sometimes find ourselves doing this. We push up, we pull the hand down, and round about here, this arm is wanting to move. Just give yourself that time to let your attention transfer gently across to the other side. One more on each side. And then pushing in two directions. another one where quite often we'll find ourselves getting to, we're halfway down, we're already wanting to do the next movement. This begins to clutter our attention, and we lose track of things like our route, our posture, those subtle changes within the body. We sort of sacrifice that awareness to the external movement and just that pushing out movement. It all becomes focused on that. Again, we could use different images to sort of try and give us a framework to understand what's happening. I mentioned the balloon full of water earlier, and if you think about a balloon full of air, really, if you were to sort of put your hands or your arms around it and squeeze it in, as you did that, it will become denser and denser and denser until eventually it would push your arms out again. And then it will become denser and denser and denser. And I mean, you're not quite in that shape, but embracing the balloon and squeezing. But you want to feel that here. You want to feel that as your hands come down, there's this sort of gentle compression. And then notice when it starts to push out again, to expand out. So it's the effect of gravity, really, drawing that weight of your upper part of your body through your back, downwards, into your belly, from there into the ground. But now the expansion comes quite naturally. Then one foot extended. Scooping the sea and looking at the sky. So in terms of one of my favorite phrases, really coming from one of the Tai Chi classics, that we seek the stillness within the movement. Partly because that stillness is a good thing for us to seek. It's definitely one of the benefits that we get from the Tai Chi practice. But also in recognition of the fact that without that stillness, the movement will soon sort of dissipate. We'll lose the quality of the movement, the flow of the movement. Maybe even just the movement might well just peter out after a while. And then grasping the tiger's ears. Tai Chi sort of moves, almost glides through a quiet, spacious landscape. It may go fast at times. There are fast movements in Tai Chi as well as slow movements. But the mind remains with one aspect in that central stillness. The changing over. Repetition means that the effect on things like muscles and tendons and ligaments and the nervous system become, as I said before, much more habitual. And so gradually that calmer quality begins to pervade more than just the exercising. It slips into our daily lives there. and then grasping the tiger's ears. One more time. And once again, just rubbing your hands together. Tapping over your face. Over your head and neck. Down to one shoulder, your arm. And the other side. Upper part of your chest. And your belly. And once again, your legs. And then pushing your heels up, working the muscles of your legs before you stand. And then turn around. And back the other way. So standing if you want to stand. All of these different elements of Tai Chi should be seen as interrelated. I've sometimes talked about what I refer to as the three jewels, the three treasures, as being like the legs of a tripod, or you get three sticks and you lean them against each other and they support each other and they're supported by each of the others. You could expand that idea to any of these ideas. The stillness supports the movement supports the stillness, etc., etc., etc. So none of them are isolated. And so the images that we use can get a little bit fuzzy around the edges. We don't want to get too attached to them. An image, an idea, even a memory or something like that is only useful while it's enhancing our awareness of what's going on, our ability to do the exercise. It's not meant to be definitive. No one thing can define what's going on in Tai Chi. We will always be paying attention to our physical posture. You can't get away from that physical aspect. If you're going to have the stillness, then the mind needs to rest somewhere. And if your body's uncomfortable, then chances are you'll find it difficult to get that calmness, and vice versa. If you're agitated, then you might be sort of just fidgeting around without realizing it. If we want the flow of energy through the body is the vehicle for that flow and for that connection to the exterior energy. And so if the vehicle isn't working properly, the energy is not going to flow properly. And if the energy is not flowing properly, then it can be an indication there's something wrong with the vehicle. We want to make connections, or maybe we can improve the flow of energy, and that will help remove the blockage, and so on and so forth. So sometimes we might focus on one particular aspect or another, but the ultimate goal is for them all to come together in the same space. So just sinking down, feet below your hips, and the standing version of rooting down. One thing we do very much want to get into the habit of doing, and which is very, very subtle in the chair, if you felt the connection to the ground through your hips, through your legs, through your feet in the chair, and if you felt that working for you, then it'd be very, very clear here. On the other hand, if it doesn't quite mean anything to you in a chair, or what is on about, think about what you're doing now and how you've got this movement up and down in your hips. Try and remember that the next time you do the seated exercises, because the feeling is very, very similar. One more time. And then change into the wild goose. One of the reasons that the order of the movements between seated and standing is slightly different is because I think, you know, standing, these are quite good exercises. They're fairly simple. We can see the relationship between what's happening in hips and shoulders to the sinking and the rising of the expansion of the legs. And when we're seated, the weight is moving, the pelvis is tilting. Again, it's a much clearer connection than we find later. So the seated version of this exercise is arguably a lot more subtle. Whereas standing can be quite tricky to really focus on that weight transfer. Now, part in the clouds. One more time. And then shake out. One foot forwards, just transferring your weight, settling in each time you arrive in one foot, that comma in the sentence. Noticing responses in the upper part of your body, which can be enhanced if you can use this image of moving through water. When you go back, you feel the pressure of the water against the back of your body, including the legs. When you go forwards, it's the front of your body. So there's this fluid change within the body, going from front to back. Raising your toes and your heel. You have the front foot slightly turned out. Both of those movements, the raising of your toes and the raising of your heel, should be accompanied by a feeling of releasing and dropping through both hips. And then stepping through. So we find, you know, if you are able to get that sense of releasing in lower back, hips and buttocks in the chair, it's basically the same thing because you're trying to sit into the leg. Now, obviously, it's a bit more difficult. There are physical issues here, you know, stability, strength of your legs, and so on and so forth. But that doesn't mean that the feeling isn't the same. And sometimes we can use our intent, think of your intent as a kind of instruction to your body saying, this is what you want to do. And just let the body work it out sometimes. Sometimes we might want to be more kind of intervening. Oh, this is happening. This is happening. On the other side. the width of your step. Remember, always give a moment to consider a step. You'll sometimes see, particularly when I'm teaching the class, but also in my own practice, I'll put the foot down and I go, oh, it doesn't feel right, and my foot will move. Quite often, that's not a conscious thing. It's like if you put a coat on and you do the buttons up wrong, you don't think, oh right, I wonder. You don't have to analyze it. Just, oh, hold on, it's not right, or maybe it's not fitting right. You just need to kind of pull it down onto your shoulders a bit more, or something like that. Things that we do every day are done with a lot less conscious effort, and in the same way, these internal qualities happen in Tai Chi. Raise and toes and here and now. And that means that, for instance, if you're able to get that sense of settling here, then we're thinking about it quite deliberately, but then when we're outside or walking down the road or doing the washing up, it'll start to happen for us. And then stepping in. And step through. And going back. We're going to do fisherman cast a net going into wind blows the willows and dragonfly skims the water. And we can make use of that awareness of subtle changes. So for instance, when I go into fisherman cast a net, my arms get to there. I can feel a little bit of an extension here and on the opposite side and in other places. And if from here I turn my body and I focus on that extension and it expands more, it will take me into wind blows the willows. We start to bring our intent into the body to produce these smaller movements. Obviously, you need to be aware of the pattern, so it comes with a little bit of experience. Have your right foot forwards. Just do a few rounds of fisherman cast a net and observe what's going on. We're going to change to wind blows the willows, so you go into your back foot. Which of those movements that you've observed are appropriate and helpful here? Which ones do you want to bring your intent, your focus to? So there's a lot of exploration, I think, in these movements, as well as trying to be precise about following instructions. Again, we have to find a balance there. Good. And try that with your left foot forwards. So first of all, fisherman cast a net. Remember that feeling of moving through water, if that's useful to you. and then wind blows the willows. Time, turn the front foot out a little bit if you're going to go forwards. Going into dragonfly skim into water. Bring the foot in and then maybe raise up to see how that feels to you today. Pelvis remaining level. Shoulders remaining level. Sitting into the supporting leg, letting your hip drop back. Taking your time. You haven't done so already, change direction. Planting the foot carefully. And then bring your feet parallel. Good. Go back to your chair. Before I forget, there'll be a class next week, but I'll be away the week after, so there'll be no class on the 21st of, let's say 21st September, 21st of August. Wishing my life away. I'll remind people of that, and I'll send an email out to people as well. But we'll be here next week, and there will be the what I'll do is next week I'll record the Thursday class as well, so there'll be a class up on YouTube for people. So I don't need my glasses off. Hands down to your sides, feel the weight of the shoulders, and embrace tiger, return to mountain. That expansion coming quite naturally into the contraction and back down into your center, and a sense just for a moment that you're able to rest in that inner position, shall we call it, that centered position. But also that inevitably leads to the expansion, just that in-breath will lead to the out-breath, vice versa. Just one more round. And rest. And open your eyes. Thank you very much as always, everybody. So definitely here next week, if you can make it, and here on Thursday also.